Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming on such a stormy evening. Thanks a lot, Brian, for your generous introduction, and thanks to the Education Department for inviting me to be here. I'm really glad to return to East Lansing. I gave a lecture here in 2012, and I didn't get a chance to see the interior of this gorgeous Zaha Hadid building, so I feel really honored to come and see it, and also to visit the Transported Man exhibition. So as Brian mentioned, today I'm going to talk about reflections in contemporary art and the role that this medium of reflective media play in engaging the viewers, in making them more aware of their presence in space, and also encouraging them to become more conscious of the public qualities of the display context, because they see themselves seeing, but they also see others seeing in that process. So I became really intrigued with this topic as I was working on this book called Mirror Affect. And I wanted to map out the trajectories, the historical trajectories of the use of this media in art. So I looked at how artists employed mirror surfaces, of how they used live video feedback, how they used digital interfaces to cultivate this awareness of instantaneous feedback and communication that is established between the artwork and the viewer. I was really intrigued at the large number of contemporary artworks that actually incorporate mirror surfaces, and I created a whole taxonomy of that, and my job became harder and harder as I conducted research on the topic. What fascinated me about it was the fact that these works were really intriguing not only because of the mesmerizing qualities, the optical effects that they create, but also because they make us think more deeply about the nature of space and time, about the subjectivity of perception and the limits of it, because ultimately an object, as phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty would say, provides a second openness. Right? It creates a space for communication, for becoming aware that sometimes, what we think we perceive may be completely different from what someone next to us perceives. And there's that magic in that moment, that there's spark when you realize that there's this kind of lack of coincidence between what you see and what the other sees. And sometimes the difference just has to do with your angle, right? Just think of your position in space in relation to a mirror object and how that might shift what you see in the mirror. And gradually I realized that many of these works also had to do with a critique of spectacle, a critique of consumer culture and surveillance. They posed really deep questions about this kind of differences that exist between appearance and reality, between our fascination with illusion and our need to rely on actuality. But the roots of this use of the medium of mirrors in art goes much more deeply in time. And in the 1960s, I realized was a key moment for the use of such media. Artists started to use mylar, they started to use actual mirror panels, they started to employ video technology to encourage viewers to think about the fact that an art object is not entirely autonomous. And this is what Marcel Duchamp actually signaled much earlier in time when he created the ready-mades. He encouraged us to think about the context of the object, about the fact that the object is not just simply secluded in this ideal sphere that is detached from reality, from the presence of people, from the material qualities of the space in which it is displayed, from the social-political aspects that inform the display context, but is ultimately contingent on a whole range of factors that inform the experience of the viewer. And this is what the artists were exploring more and more in the 1960s, where we witnessed this kind of key moment of transformation from modern to contemporary art. And there's this contingence of the art object that becomes immediately visible in many of these works by Robert Morris, Luca Samaras, Joan Jonas, Terry Riley, and so on and so forth. It's a really long list. But I really was wondering why this happens at this particular point in time. Why is it that in the 1960s, of all times, people are so interested in reflections? On the one hand, it's the popular culture, it's the the TV culture of the 1950s and also the 60s. It's the emergence of video technology that becomes portable with the Sony Portapack, which is this camera that could be handheld, which is a huge change in terms of the availability of this type of technology. Of course, you can think about the countercultures of the 1960s and their fascinations with otherworldly realms, with expanding the boundaries of consciousness and stepping in other worlds through meditation or through other processes of inducing different psychic states, right? And mirrors kind of offer this entry point within a realm that is somehow connected to the imagination, that implies some sort of transformation of selfhood and of the world around us. So those are some of the factors that inform this shift. Another thing has to do with this move away from abstract expressionism, which is a style that is really forceful up to this period of time. Most artists working in schools were created abstract expressionist works, really informed by the practice of someone like Jackson Pollock and his gestural techniques. And this kind of notion was dominant about the artwork being the result of this active subjective self-expression, right? Jackson Pollock would say that he likes to control the flow of the paint and is capable of doing that, even though we realize that that vibrant gesture also implies some randomness to it. So these artists are kind of getting away from that, right? There's this kind of move away from the subjectivity of the auteur, of the author of the artwork that has full control over it, to a different mode of perceiving the artwork, of opening it up to the presence of the viewer, to the variability of his movements in space, to the way in which he can actually manipulate the content of the reflections that end up being part of the mirror object. So we'll look more closely at a number of works that incorporate mirrors, and I also wanted to allude to the theme of the exhibition. I really like the premise of it, this whole idea of art being close to magic, right? And this kind of notion that it has to do with this in-between space between what we perceive as being familiar, what we perceive as being something that we know, and what is completely unfamiliar. And it takes, as the curator of this exhibition says, it takes this kind of act of belief, of dedication of the viewer, to be ultimately tricked, to enjoy the illusion of it and the complexity that lies behind those magic acts. And in a sense, this is the very foundation of art, right? It really takes that element of trust, of acknowledging that an object is an actual artwork, of thinking about it as an object that has an additional power to make us look at things from a different perspective. It really channels our attention in a different manner. It makes us look more closely, it makes us think more profoundly. So I've subdivided the talks into 3 different sections. I'm going to talk about versatile reflective objects first, kind of objects that incorporate mirrors and are highly adaptable and focus a lot on the transformation of objects that otherwise might appear to be impersonal. And that might actually encourage performative responses to them in the end. The second part will focus on environments, on larger works that take over an entire space of the exhibition and encourage more immersive types of experience. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about the mirror as a screen, as a space of projection, and this kind of contradiction between the virtuality of the mirror and the materiality of it, the edges of the mirror, the physicality of it, that cannot be fully avoided. So I'm going to start with a work that is very well known. It's kind of one of those key examples of minimalist art. It's a work by Robert Morris entitled Mirror Cubes from 1965. So he basically created this work based on this concept of a cube, right? A wooden cube, a geometric shape that is unitary, that has a strong gestalt, that can be immediately recognized when you encounter it. But he decided to position 4 such cubes made out of wood and then covered in mirror plates in the exhibition setting, which makes you aware very much of your presence within the space, also perhaps of the shape of the space in which you find yourself, which might actually be a cube, if you think of the white cube kind of typology of display spaces, which no longer applies today to many contemporary museums that have much more complex configuration. So what this work does is to make you think about oneness, but also to make you think, if you are in the presence of the actual objects, about things that are fragmented, about differences, right? Because it's a unitary work in terms of shape, but if you are going to think about this kind of shifting field of reflections across the surface of these cubes, and the way in which your image would be fragmented, would be kind of perceptible from different points of view, and perhaps the way in which you'd become aware of the presence of other people in that space, the whole idea of unity, of oneness that is associated with minimalism is called into question. And Robert Morris is also writing a lot about sculpture during this period of time. He writes a couple of essays that are called Notes on Sculpture. And in this essay, in one of them, he says that at this point in time, he feels that the object becomes less self-important. The object of art is less self-important. It's not the only focus, right? It makes us think that we need to pay attention to the full context of display. It makes us think that the whole process of encountering the work in Robert Morris's work becomes much more democratic and open-ended. And he also created works that were much more participatory in terms of people actually being able to engage with objects, interacting them in actual tactile ways. There's a work by Larry Bell, another work focusing on the volume of a cube that is simulated through the use of these plates. He's an artist who's been working a lot with glass and mirrors in his practice since the 1960s. He thinks about glass as being this kind of solid liquid, and he says it has these magic qualities to it. And he's thinking in his practice about different degrees of visibility. He is often using this process of lamination of glass. He's adding metallic coats to the actual glass to change its colors, to make it more or less translucent. So here he applied this kind of metallic coat to the glass. And as you can see, some of the cubes are more transparent, where these others are less translucent. And what's important about these works is that these are objects that are highly very versatile. They are adaptable depending on the space in which you show them in. This was at the Whitney Biennial of this year. They were shown on the 5th floor terrace of the museum. And they are the kind of works that make you look at them, but also across them, right? They become this kind of interface for how you see the world around the object. So they are very playful as a result of that. There's a work by Akash Danish. She's an artist who started as a painter and then turned more and more to where it's a conceptual art practice. She has also created interventions in public spaces. And this is a work called Pyramids of Conscience. It's one of her recent works that deals with environmentalism and with the pollution of water. So she's using this kind of concept and shape of the pyramid, which actually stands for, this kind of symbol of ancient civilizations, the remnants of which have withstood the test of time. But then she's dealing with this kind of problem that is very pressing and has to do with the immediate present. So in one of the pyramids, she incorporates tap water from the location of the exhibition. In another one of them, she's incorporated polluted water. This was from the Mississippi River. This was an exhibition happening at the Pulitzer Foundation in St. Louis. Another one incorporated oil that's polluting the water. And another one was a pyramid that was completely made out of mirrors, of these mirror plates. So she's, again, just as Larry Bell, dealing with different degrees of translucency, different degrees of visibility of problems that exist within our society. And she's asking the viewer to actually face herself in the mirror, right? It's almost like calling upon us to register that need for responsibility. Right? You almost have like a sort of guilty conscience when you're put on the spot, literally in front of the mirror after enjoying all those visual effects that have to do with translucency. You encounter yourself, there's something playful about it. There's something that's also deeply troubling, the fact that we need to step up. We have agency in this process, and perhaps if we each of us took a step towards the way in which we relate to our environments, things would change. So turning to our work within the exhibit, this is a work that does not actually incorporate mirrors, but it incorporates an index of that. The mirror is, in this case, a sign, a visual reference to an object that was owned by John Dee. John Dee was a scientist, he was an amazing mathematician, he was an astrologer at the court of Elizabeth I, and he was really fascinated about getting into contact with other worlds. He really wanted to devise actually a way of communicating with other realms. So he employed a medium, and he started working on creating a whole system of communicating with this other world, with the occult, invoking angels and demons that might help him decode a language, which he called the Enochian language, that would guarantee him entry into this spiritual realm. So Joachim Koester is building on this whole narrative. He's an artist who's highly interested in revisiting the stories from the past and giving them new meaning from the time of the present. So he has taken a picture of this obsidian mirror that was owned by John Dee that is currently found in the British Museum. And what we see here is this kind of, black, dense interface. It also makes us aware of the quality of the material. There are all these scratches that we can view in this image. And also there's this kind of a reflection of another space. Perhaps it's a door, right, that exists in the gallery of the British Museum, but is also kind of a symbolical element of communication with another space and the connection to that whole story of John Dee. So it's one of those fascinating works. It also makes us call into question whether perhaps an image of an object that has such mystical power manages to carry with it some of that mystical quality in itself. This is Jonathan Monk's work. I'm sure you're all familiar with it, even more than I am, if you've been to the Transported Man exhibition for a couple of times. It's truly a versatile work because it changes constantly on a daily basis. It actually changed from this morning, so I was taken aback. I looked at it in the morning, and these two hands that are holding an object, the object that they are holding is changed on a daily basis, and the objects are chosen by members of the museum staff and volunteers, I guess. Right? So this morning it was holding this kind of roll of string, and when I went up today, it was holding coins, right, this evening. So it completely shifted. It really is that sort of mutable object. And the artist doesn't want to control the work fully. So we see this element of trying to relinquish that full agency that an artist has over the art object and the appearance of it. And this poses serious challenge for the art institution in terms of documenting the artwork. I was talking to Brian about all the pictures that need to be taken of all the various objects that are placed in the cup of these two hands, right? And I think it's a kind of work that makes us think about what art is, right? And art as a process of communication, art as a process of exchange. The fact that the two wax hands are placed onto this mirror plate pedestal, right, makes us think about duality, make us think about reciprocity. To me, it's the kind of work that calls to mind this whole concept of gift giving that was explored by anthropologist Marcel Mauss. And he writes about the fact that in various cultures, we observe this act of gift-giving as being really essential, crucial for social exchanges to occur. It becomes like a sort of contract. And according to Moss, giving a gift always implies some sort of responsibility, some sort of obligation, even if it's not literally spelled out, right? If you give something, there's some expectation to receive something back, perhaps, and also some sort of compelling need to do that, whether it's an actual object that you give in return, or whether it's a service that you provide, or whether there's a full friendship that evolves out of the result of gift giving. And Jonathan Monk is also thinking about this kind of contractual relationship that exists between the artists and the institutions. He's delegating responsibility to the museum to be part of this exchange. Not only are they showing the work, but they are actively responding to it. And they need to place another object on a daily basis and completely shift the work as a result of that. Also find it fascinating that many of the objects that are being chosen are somehow related to art, to crafts that are being made. So I kind of wonder what's on the mind of the participants when they make those choices. Shifting to mirror habitats, moving now to works of art that are much larger in scale. They incorporate mirrors. They are environments. They are spaces that are much more immersive. They call for almost being lost in the space of reflections. As I was telling you, in the 1960s, there's a huge boom in terms of the use of these materials and also in the creation of this kind of infinity rooms. This is an example of a work by Luca Samaras, Mirror Room, which is in the Albright Knox collection in Buffalo, but there are many others, and I'm going to give you a couple of other examples. So he has always been fascinated by mirrors, which he thinks are key for our survival and for processes of sociability. He thinks that we cannot actually survive without other people and without mirrors. This is one of the things that he states. And I think he's the sort of person who always looked into the mirror for this idea of otherness, of himself and of transformation. So created this environment that's also covered by mirrors on the exterior of it. I'm sure, sorry, I don't have a picture of that as well. And at the very center of it, there are lodged over here two objects that otherwise would be highly familiar with to us, highly recognizable. So it's a chair and a table. It's kind of reference to a very livable domestic sort of environment. But nonetheless, once it is covered by mirror, it becomes this otherworldly realm, right? And some people may think of his work in relation to narcissism, but he was not really keen on that. It's not about the ego. It's not about fulfilling this kind of need to encounter your own image. Actually, when you step in this environment, you feel lost. You feel disoriented, you have balance problems, and you are much more drawn to the visual effects that you notice as a result of the splinters of light. And you become also aware of this kind of obstacles in your pathway, right? This incongruity that exists between this 3D objects and then this shifting field of reflections that is flat, but nonetheless creates this virtual depth to it. So he's dealing with a lot with this sort of ambivalence in his practice. And he also envisioned the work as a kind of space where people would participate. They would be able to somehow draw with their bodies through the manipulation of their reflections through body motion. So again, we have a very different mode of spectatorship, right? The kind of spectatorship that is no longer based on this idea of looking and contemplating an artwork, being static and thinking about it as an object that is being fixed in space and time. The work by Ouska, I think many of you may be already familiar with her work because it's been featured recently quite prominently. And she had a retrospective exhibition at the Hirshhorn that will be traveling to the Broad in LA in fall. And in the 1960s, she created a number of infinity mirror rooms This is one in which you cannot actually stop. You cannot actually enter it, but there's this peep show that she has set up for us. There are two apertures in this chamber that has a hexagonal configuration, and through it you can see this kind of field of hexagonal light bulb patterns that are flickering, and they are changing colors. There's this kind of rhythm to them. And you become aware of your presence in space, but you're also kind of forced in this kind of visual dialogue with someone else who may be looking into the room from another side of it. Again, she's trying to overcome the idea of narcissism. These works of art and the mirror rooms she creates are, in her words, about self-obliteration, about leaving behind your self-focused perspective upon the world. She really wants you to kind of feel as if you were dissolving into the space, becoming one with it. And she's also thinking a lot about this kind of notion of love and the contagious aspect of it, how love brings us closer to others and sometimes dissolves the boundaries between ourselves and others. And her work is also informed by her hallucinations. She has a mental disorder that kind of makes her have this sort of experiences when she can no longer tell the boundaries between her body and the space surrounding it. And in the 60s, she also worked on performances. She also worked on staging photographs of herself in this sort of mirror rooms. There's a work by Dan Graham. He is an artist, a conceptual artist who's been working a lot with mirrors, integrating them both in performances and in more sculptural spaces, pavilions that he created that are sometimes placed in outdoor spaces. And this is a work he presented at the Venice Biennial in 1976. And when he created it, he said about the work that he wanted it to be the kind of work that makes viewers less focused on this kind of contemplative mode of encountering the work as a fixed object. He wanted them to be very much aware of their presence in space. And it's also the kind of work that cannot function in the absence of people who are present within it. So it consists of two spaces that are connected to each other through this transparent screen that also has an insulating purpose. The rooms are acoustically insulating from each other, and they have two entrances on the side, and you can move freely in between them. So he's setting up, like a behavioral scenario for visitors to the Venice Biennial. So one room has at one end of it this see-through screen, and the room adjacent to it has at its end a mirror screen that is covering its back wall entirely. So there are two reflective interfaces. One of them is a see-through reflective interface, right? And one of them is the actual mirror that allows for greater reflexivity. And people would kind of shift their position in between these two environments. And it's the kind of work that makes you think a lot about voyeurism, about the control of behavior, of what we may choose to do or not do when we are in the presence of other people. It also encouraged a lot of spontaneity in terms of the non-verbal modes of communication that started to emerge between participants that were found in the two spaces. So it gave them a lot of freedom in terms of how to orchestrate their interaction with the space. It's ultimately the kind of work that needed the participants for it to exist. It's a work that I'm sure you all know, the Bean, the well-known Bean in Chicago. It's actually called the Cloud Gate by Anish Kapoor. And even though it appears to be so seamless, it's characterized by this oneness when we look at it. If we were to approach it from the side, it would actually look like an egg, like this ovoid shape. You'd not even be aware of the fact that it's actually an arched space. But it's actually made up of over 160 stainless steel plates, very large components that were then brought together. But the edges between them, the seams, were polished up to the point at which they are no longer visible. Anish Kapoor is an artist who's really interested in this idea that the object he creates almost appears to be self-made, to be self-created, as if there's no hand of the artist that was involved in the production of it. And there are various modes of approaching it, really. It's a work that's really fascinating. It really brings you, on this kind of threshold between narcissism and voyeurism. It's very playful. It encompasses this image of the surrounding architecture, but it's also characterized by another dimension of the interaction that is much more intimate. Because once you step under the arch, once you are under this kind of gateway space, the experience becomes much more intimate, and you also kind of lose track of your reflection. It becomes part of this kind of vortex of images that are floating above your head, and they are repeated over and over again, and you become this kind of minuscule being that's part of a crowd. You are one of many other people, in a way in which you are not when you are outside the arch and you look at yourself in the mirror reflections. There's a work by Oliver Eliason. He's a Danish Icelandic artist whose work is really fascinating. He collaborates very extensively with scientists and with architects, with mathematicians. And this is a work that was part of his retrospective called Take Your Time at MoMA. And it's an installation that I actually saw in person, and I was really taken aback by the effect it had upon me. So you would enter a room, and you would notice this hanging mirror disc that is attached to the ceiling. And this object would move. It would revolve gradually in space. Had a really disorienting effect upon your body. Many people decided to lie down, and either because you felt disoriented or you wanted to emulate the way they would relate to the work, you'd immediately decide to adopt the same position in space. Some of the people, when they saw the pictures, when they thought about the work, they thought it was the kind of work that has a very relaxing, calming effect upon you. But it also created a feeling of unease. Right? The moment you step down, there would be this kind of constant delay of the encounter with your self-image, since the reflections would be slipping away across the surface of the mirror disc. And the mirror disc is actually composed of strips of reflective foil that are stretched across its surface. And you'd see the edges of them. So unlike Anish Kapoor, who really wants to cover up everything, make the object as seamless as possible, Eliason is really interested in the construction of the object and showing you the fact that it is manufactured. He really thinks that, that whole division between nature and culture is completely artificial. What's important about this is the fact that your image would be slightly fragmented at that point, right? Once your reflection would circulate across the edges of those strips of foil, they would be slightly torn apart for a very split second of time. So there's that element of identification that is underlying narcissistic processes of contemplation of one's image is constantly undermined in this work as well. Reflective screens. As I was telling you, there are also works that I feel deal a lot with this notion of the mirror as a screen of projection, a screen that is situated in between this material screen, a material screen that has its hard edges, and then this idea of an abysmal space that lies beyond it and is illusionary. So I couldn't help but start with referencing Marcel Duchamp's mirror in the exhibition, and this kind of idea of coming up with a signature as this point of interference with that perfect parallelism that would exist between the space outside the mirror and the space within it. And this is one of those assisted ready-mades, right? He picks up an object, a very mundane one, right? He sets it in the gallery setting, but he also modifies it. So in that sense, it's an assisted ready-made. And it's a kind of work that makes us think a lot about the nature of art, right? We often associate art with mimesis, with things that we represent, that already exists. But he also tells us that the work of art can open up other questions, right? By showing us so prominently his signature, he's making us think about authorship. He's making us think about the role of the artist in bringing the aura to the object, in making it unique through his signature. And I think seeing this work also, after the death of Duchamp, it becomes a work that alludes to this kind of haunting presence of the influence of Duchamp throughout the 20th century. And he would say that, in one of his statements, that he never looks for himself in the mirror. It's never a search for that idea of the truthful identity of who he is when he looks at the mirror. Instead, he looks at the space of playfulness, of in-betweenness, between what he might think he is and what might others think that he is, the space between the I and the me, Duchamp would say. The work by Michelangelo Pistoletto, he's an Italian artist. He created a whole range of works that were called mirror paintings in the 1960s. He's using stainless steel plates for this reflective medium that he incorporates in the works, and he decides to integrate within the mirror screen also these silhouettes, this presence of other people. They are drawn on transparent paper. Sometimes they are based on photographs that were taken at the time. And some of them reference, everyday situation of people that are sometimes looking at art, of people that are contemplating, thinking, talking with other people. And some of them have political connotations as well, as this one that focuses on the anti-Vietnam demonstrations that were going on at the time. He's thinking a lot about mirrors as these materials that are characterized by this instantaneity, by the immediacy of the encounter with one's image. But to that, he adds this visual interference, in a sense just as Duchamp did through the insertion of the signature. But he's pasting these other figures. He's creating a narrative context, right? And he's putting us within this context. He's asking us where would we stand in relation, if we were in the 1960s when the work was created, where would we stand in relation to these demonstrations? If we happen to have our reflection integrated in that particular work, we become part, imaginatively, of the crowd of protesters demonstrating against the Vietnam War. Thinking a lot about responsibility and about the roles we play within the world and how we need to make decisions, informed decisions about where we stand. And we really need to do that when we are in front of his works. We need to decide whether we want to stand at an angle, we want to integrate our reflection within their surface, and as part of this kind of symbolical act of being co-opted by the environment of them. There's a work by Joan Jonas. She created these performative pieces that incorporated mirror panels in the late 1960s and in the early 70s. And she had a whole group of performers that would manipulate these reflective panels. And they appeared to be really heavy. The movements would not, be very fluid. That would be quite constrained because of the weight of these objects. And they would step on stage and they would orient these reflective props towards the viewers. They would become this sort of shields that are pressed against their bodies, and they would become this kind of lenses for the gaze of the viewers that are part of the audience. So it's kind of a way of also turning the objectifying gaze of the people who are watching you onto them. So there's this kind of sense that these are these protective optical shields that these viewers are manipulating. The person over here is actually Richard Serra. One over here there is Robert Smithson. So there are also some cues to other people who are in the audience in the documentation of that. And John Jonas was saying that people were very nervous that those mirrors would break, that some of them would kind of collapse. She was not nervous at all about that, but she liked that tension. She liked that affective potential that was created as people were trying to connect so much to the bodies of the performance, of their movements in space. This is a work by Carolyn Pie. It's an installation that is found in a public space in Vienna. It's in a passageway. I encountered it at a point in time when I was not thinking at all about writing about mirrors in art, and then as I was pursuing this topic, I had this kind of flashback of my encounter with it several years before that. He is a conceptual artist working in photography and also in installation art. In this case, he explores this concept of pi, of the number pi, the irrational number. And as you know, it's the kind of number we associate with 3.14, but we cannot fully calculate all the other decimals that are following this number. And this number is often part of calculations that have to do with statistics, with estimations about things that, that happened or will happen. So you cannot really see the whole exhibition here of the work, but it incorporates 14 mirror panels, such as the one over here, that have different types of text on them. So this particular one says that it references the total number of hours that people worked in Austria since the beginning of the year. And it lists the number of work hours over there. There are also references to things that have to do with war. For example, the total number of weapons that have been purchased since the beginning of the year, the total number of HIV infections, the total number of days that are still needed for the Chernobyl area to become livable again. So he's using data that sometimes has to do with the past, sometimes has to do with the future, and approximations, estimates about it. And he makes the passerby within the space very much aware of this data, and also the shifting quality of it, the fact that this information is not static, right, that is in motion, and he updates the data on a yearly basis, working with the Sociological Institute in Vienna to make sure that the data stays up to date as much as possible on an annual basis. So on the one hand, there's this kind of desire to see those figures shift in space when you are there. There's also this kind of awareness of your movement in space in relation to them, and that kind of agency that you have in relation to some aspects of it. If you were working in Vienna, let's say, as an Austrian, but it also makes you think about other people, about who is counted as part of the statistics. What if you're a migrant worker? Would your work hours be counted as part of this estimation or not? So it raises all these questions about yourself and others. I know this work by Rondon On that I find really enchanting in the Transported Man exhibition, called Work for Oracles. And I was talking to Brian this morning as we were looking at it, and the different temporalities that it brings together. So it's composed out of this colored reflective screens that kind of speak back to you. They invite you to get closer to the work, to observe your reflections in them, but they also kind of subvert that full identification with your self-image, as we've seen in some other examples of this work. Because sometimes, depending on the size of the window, you can only see your feet, or you can only see your head, or sometimes you cannot encounter your self-reflection at all because they are placed at a very high height. So they make you aware of the immediacy of this correspondence between your presence in space and the reflection, but it's also work about a different time, right? Because that particular wall is covered in whitewashed newspapers, and he's making the work responsive to the site where it is displayed. So these particular newspapers were taken from Detroit Press, as far as I could understand, right? And if you look closely at them, you can actually, identify items that were in the news in March, right? And you start thinking about what matters, what events stayed with us, what had more relevance than others in terms of the way they impacted our lives, or they impacted perhaps our whole society at the time. And the fact that they are whitewashed and you can see the edges, it creates also this impression of depth, of things that are receding in time. Right? So that's the element of the past. Right? We talked about the presence of the viewer, the present, the immediacy of it, the element of the past. But the title of the work is also telling us that it's about the future. It's about oracles. It's about predicting what is going to happen. And the fact that these windows are all different in sizes, they have different colors, and they also denote a sort of absence, right? They also, in some cases, they do not reflect us back because they're not in the immediate vicinity, and they seem to conceal a world that lies beyond their surface, that is not within our immediate proximity. So in that sense, they make us think about the future, about how things might change, about what might have been valid, for example, in March when I looked at the news, might no longer be of relevance today, or might have shifted, might have transformed. It's also a way of making us responsible about changing our times, about shifting them. Once you see yourself in the mirror, it has this kind of playful quality to it. The fact that your presence is acknowledged also makes you more responsible about how you shape the world around you. So to go back to some of the first points and the whole significance of mirrors in contemporary art right now, I think they are very strongly related to the participatory quality of art and to the changes we've witnessed in the production and the reception of the work. The kind of works that have become more public, that orient our attention not only to ourselves and what we might think about a work of art, but also about how others are responding to them. And I'm going to end by mentioning this notion that art, the role of it, is to make us present, to make us more conscious of our presence in space, but also to show us to ourselves, right? And this is what reflective works are doing. And there's a whole point to this, right? Once you become more conscious of yourself, you can also shape the world you find yourself in. And this whole idea is fully explored by Alva Noé in his book called Strange Tools. He has this idea about the art object as being a strange tool that has not a very specific function, that was behind it, the purpose of its construction, and that constantly makes us think about new objects that we might want to design, about new ideas that we might have, of transformations that we want to bring through the world. I'm going to stop here, but I'm eager to have a conversation as well if there's time, and hear your comments or questions. Yeah.
I just have a comment and a question. So the use of mirrors, you say, sort of began in about the mid-1960s. And you alluded to this at the end, the work that depicted the Vietnam protests.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just thinking that perhaps that was an incredible moment in time where it made a lot of sense to start using mirrors because artists, I'm assuming, they really were challenging people to be involved.
Exactly.
Rather than presenting a work that we just passively sit and look at, the artist is challenging us to be involved.
Sure, be part of the group.
Art or in life.
Yeah, thanks for that thought. It's something that I was really interested in as well, the relation between the social movements and this kind of works that have very subtle political implications in a way. We may not immediately think of them in all cases. With Pistoletto, it's pretty clear in the case of that Vietnam War. But in some others, it may not be as blatant. But I think it's really crucial, the fact that it's a time when people are more aware of these differences and of this need of creating alliances with others that are different from us. I think that's key to the interest in mirroring processes. Yeah.
So it's a really wide range of objects.
Sure. I know.
And I was thinking about the fact that different artists that you were showing have different political orientations also, or some whose politics isn't really very political.
Exactly.
That's what I was against. And, with Van Dam, there's the fact that
Right.
his work is using mirrors in a way that's specifically about surveillance.
Exactly.
That you can't see, which maybe corresponds then to the next one's topic. But you have works of him that incorporate mirrors, but also video cameras.
Yeah.
He was interested in corporate architecture during the 90s, and the fact that oftentimes these skyscrapers have those two-way glass with their
Exactly.
cabinets so that you can't see in. And so there's a sense of something sinister happening behind the
Right.
mirror. And so the mirror is simultaneously showing you yourself, but also hiding
Yeah.
what you can't see. So I was thinking about the fact that when you're looking at the mirrors can be where these people feel almost they maybe almost wide as an array of versions of oil painting,
Right.
let's say, or wood that you can make any number of forms out of. And the material itself is really it seems like it's almost free of any particular sort of social function.
It's ambivalent, so it has this ambiguity to it. It's slippery in a literal and symbolical way.
Yeah, and I was thinking also about a lot of art in the 60s. People critics didn't like it because they thought that it was just a spectacle. They thought it was fun mirrors. It would be amusement parks.
Right, fun houses.
Where it's not made like it's an amusement park. It's a successful work of public sculpture for that reason because it's very popular. But oftentimes so the political message that's associated with this work having to do with the community together is lost
Right.
on a lot of the audience.
Yeah.
But I guess I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the potentially broad array of ways in which these works speak about or not speak about violence.
Yeah. No, certainly that's a topic I explored in my book. Something that came up throughout this whole process of looking at these particular examples, and some of them really engage with spectacle culture. There's no denial of that. But spectacle also has some political potential, even though it might be compromising, it might render us more passive, according to Guy Debord. But sometimes it's also something that brings us closer to other people within the proximity of them. And I think once you have a mirror, it's one thing to have a cinematic experience, right? That comes up in the analogies that Debord is using, even if you think about the cover of his Spectacle Society book with his people that are watching a screen and are somehow numb to whatever is happening to them or to the presence of each other. But with mirrors, it's also rendering you aware of the physical proximity of other people next to you. And I think that adds that element of unease and unfamiliarity. It's not just a spectacle that you are somehow protected of. There's this kind of ambiguity, that thin line between, this kind of encounter with one's image, but also the fact that you are constantly exposed, right? You can never be a full voyeur. And I think, as you said, in some cases, it really depends on the trajectory of the practice of the artist, right? The works of Dan Graham or Ken Loom, for example, are very closely associated with those political stakes. It's also because of their trajectory of their practice and this other things that we know about that works that inform the reading of other works that we might think otherwise to be more playful as being politically informed. But I think there's a potential for that political statement, a more poetic take on that in many of these other works, even though it's not, a statement that is fully laid out in the works of Olaf Eliason, for example. It's nothing as literally stated. There's not an index that's a reference to a political or social circumstance, but nonetheless, you cannot help but think of your vulnerability as a viewer within that space, and of the fact that it is a controlling situation. And by choosing to go under the lens and take your time with others, it's ultimately a decision that you are making to spend the time with others and to make your image seen by others. And I've thought a lot about this kind of affective alliances that inform this sort of connections and that inform political stakes as well. So that was very much part of the project. Yeah.
little mirror in the middle and reflects the artist optically. And this kind of metaphor of the mirror, the artwork as a mirror on the world, and the way that mirrors sort of historically in art history kind of have to do with the artist more than the viewer. It's like a kind of magical screen on which the artist is able to produce, you know. And so, you know, we turn in the 20th century more to the spectator, and I wonder if you think that some of these contemporary artists are thinking about the mirror. I mean, like the convex mirror as a tool for, you know, wonder making or art
Right.
making. You know, it's like the mirror as an artistic.
Right, I mean, the mirror has always been there. I mean, it has been there as a tool for improving the accuracy of representation. If you think of the camera obscura and the use of mirrors to reverse the image, and that's a great point. The fact that, you know, this kind of representation was pointing back to the artist, not the viewer in that case, the artist as witness of the act of depicting the work sometimes, where this kind of authority figures that would be a witness to the act of creating the work, and that would also somehow legitimize it and add more power to the work of art. But yeah, there's a shift in the whole mode of thinking about its presence and its role, and it really becomes this democratizing medium, but a democratizing medium that nonetheless carries with it that potential for surveillance and control. That's always part of it. You cannot let go. That's why I'm thinking about the unease that is part of the process of the encounter with these mirror images.
It's like that Duchamp is the switch.
Yeah,
That is like an artwork, but it also
and it's still disturbing. The fact that he's authoring your mirror reflection at that point, right? It's still like the control that he's exerting over whatever ends up being part of the mirror lens, right? Yeah.
Sort of, I think also the feeling I was getting that the metaphor of mirror has been used as a way of talking about the role of realism and basically realistic self-narrative.
Yeah. 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 Right. Exactly. Yeah.
So I was thinking about how, the mirror, physically stand in as the art object, depending on the context, is going to reflect, either how frequently I want to use mirrors to reflect ugly realities. Not very often, right? So, the beautiful skylines of New York.
But they also distance us from this reality, whether mesmerizing or not, right?
Possibly, yeah. I think, but I'm thinking about the difference between Anish Kapoor and Bay, for example,
Right.
Stonebreakers. They're very different mirrors.
Of course. Yeah. But they might also capture things that, in this kind of space might not want to be seen. I mean, ultimately it is a public space, still under surveillance in terms of guards being present there, but it has also been the site of protests that were organized, of people actually, going there for demonstrations and holding up signs and kind of wanting to have this kind of echoing effect of their political statement in that particular space. So it is an icon of spectacle, but it can be corrupted in various ways for multiple uses. Okay. Thanks a lot for all your comments and wonderful questions.